assessments, and those would be given every 3 to 4 weeks by the grade level, and based on 3 to 4 skills that we have just taught over the last couple of weeks, so we can see whether or not our students got those skills, and then from that point I can do small group instruction or I can reteach based on those formatives. We hope to have those all finished by the end of the school year. It's a little bit longer process because we need to test some of those questions out for that. Do you have questions?
Board Member Baguirov.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate Superintendent and Dr. Lally on this great work. All the teachers, all the principals, all the administrators who are always overlooked in these type of situations. And thank you, Dr. Lally, for preparing this. I took great interest in reviewing those courses of studies over the weekend, but I took a special interest with computer science. And I have to say I was very impressed with what our kindergartners and first graders and third graders and fifth graders are going to be learning. I wish I learned all that when I was their age and in their situation, but we didn't have computers back then. So very impressive. I'm very impressed. Undoubtedly, this is going to have a huge positive effect on academics. I guess what I want to ask is, how did we function up until now without this? Because, for example, even you were mentioning pacing guides, we've only introduced them last year in 2016, and this was a big deal for us as a board. We finally were able to get that done with the pacing guides, and you've since updated them further, and now finally we have course of study done as of 2017, some of them for the first time ever, others are major revisions. How is it possible that a huge urban district like this was functioning all these decades and years without structure, without something like this?
Many times what happens in school systems is we use the textbook as our curriculum. Right. And the one thing that we need to understand about textbook adoptions is there are 23 adoption states. Ohio is not one of them. So the bulk of the textbook, except for those Ohio editions that they're now making for us because we've gotten wise to them that we're not Texas and we're not New York State. So they do an Ohio edition, but the bulk of the content in a textbook that's published by a national textbook company tends to be based on what those 23 adoption states want inside their materials. So with that in mind, they've created these Ohio versions, which are just some add-ins that they put into a textbook. So when I teach a curriculum out of a textbook, based on that textbook, I'm teaching really something that's not totally correlated to the Ohio standards, because about 65% of any textbook that you look at is correlated to the standards. So that 35%, unless a school district says don't teach that 35%, we're still teaching some things that our students, it's nice to know, but it's not a need to know for Ohio. So we have that issue that many schools, not just here, but many schools always followed, because we adopt the materials. I teach the book. Mm-hmm. That's what I teach. I don't teach the skill. I don't teach the standard necessarily. I teach the book and whatever the book tells me to teach in there.
And what would be your, I guess, prognosis in terms of improvement of our academics and curriculum as a result of all this work that was done?
One of the things that teacher leaders will be working with staff on is making sure that they're following the course of study and they're following the pacing guides. When we've been so accustomed to following the materials as opposed to following the required course of study and the required pacing guides, we tend to not really adjust well to that quickly. So they are working with staff on that, and you'll notice on our CCIP goals, one of the action steps is to work with principals and staff for them to understand how to use the courses of study that have been developed, as well as the pacing guides. That's a year-long project for us this year, getting people to say course of study, getting people to say pacing guides, which they already were because of the work that was done previously, but getting them to talk about the I can statements, which falls right into the Marzano, that's setting a goal for the day. I can find the characters in a story, which you'll see right on top of that language arts, those skills along the side there. So that's the work that we're doing, and the teacher leaders will be focusing in on that and supporting that work in every single building in the classrooms. And that's one of the reasons that it's so important to have them there, because we can roll this out and it can sit on your shelf. Right. So we have the teacher leaders right there working with people.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Superintendent Core?
I can say, having been out in just about every school so far, some more than others, that I'm actually starting to see the I can statements written on the chalkboards. So it is starting to resonate with the teachers, depending on the building. They will start out with I can statements because students should know before they're taught what they're about to learn. They should be able to tell you when you walk into a classroom, what are you learning today? They should be able to answer that question. If they can't, I would have a concern. But teachers are now starting with the I can statements. And the other great thing about the pacing guides as it relates to being connected to the standards is, we have a transiency rate. Our students move from school to school. And, we talk about equity. We should be able to go from one school to another school and everybody is pretty much in the same space, in the same place. With the opportunity for assessment and reteaching, that's not always an opportunity, that's not always a moment when you look at what students have learned and think, why aren't the students getting it? If you're starting to get certain things back where children are missing 70 or 80% of it, that's an opportunity for the teacher leader to help the teachers say, it might be your approach to how you're teaching it. It might not be the children. It might be the approach. Let's try something new.
Vice President Dr. Rountree?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to say how delighted I am. I mean, for the entire time I've been on this board, that's what I've been asking for, some standardization. And I know at one meeting someone said, well, why are you so hyped about standardization? Well, we're a highly mobile district. And if we don't have some way in which to anticipate kids moving from one building to another, when we already know that's the fact. That is a fact. So we can't design a program for our comfort, but we must design a program for the kids' need. And we have a need for this. And so I'm hoping the teachers, you answered most of my question. Will the teacher leaders be responsible for monitoring lesson plans and making sure that the teachers are following up with fidelity? And you said that, yes, they were. Because the principals can't do everything.
Right. They're there as a support. They don't have any evaluative authority, but they're there as support to make sure that the curriculum is being taught. Absolutely. When they go into a walkthrough observation, when they're monitoring the classrooms, yes.
See, that makes sense to me. Even though they are not evaluating the teacher, they can answer a simple question: were the lesson plans available? I mean, that has been an issue with 3- and 4-year-old lesson plans in folders, and no one checking or making anyone accountable for not turning in a lesson plan on a weekly basis. And then it seems as if there's going to be some kind of cross-building or district-wide analysis of how kids are doing every several weeks. They can do that with this. It just seems to me they can do that.
So I just want to reiterate, our teacher leaders are they are there to support the teachers and help them and model. As far as the accountability piece, that will remain with the principal. We don't want to cross that aisle because we want that trusting relationship between the teacher coach and the teacher, so they don't feel like they're running to the principal to inform them of things they're doing wrong. So if they have a good relationship, because it's all about relationships, to tell the coach, hey, so-and-so, Dr. Rountree didn't have her lesson plans this week. Could you make sure you work with her?
Okay, I'm still trying to be convinced that should be a higher priority. For me, it just is. I think if you don't have direction and know direction in which you're going, how can you get there? I mean, we want the kids to write down I can. I want teachers to do that. I want it to be, I want us to hold teachers accountable. That's just been just an issue for me since I've been on this board. That it's very confusing as to how I can teach without a lesson plan. I did like Dr. Baguirov. I went to my area, social studies, and I read through government, and I read it from the eye of a first-year teacher and an experienced teacher to see where was the difference and how, you know, so I'm still looking at that. I'm still trying to have a bit more concrete understanding that if I were a first-year teacher, how could I use some of the resources? And I didn't, and maybe it's because I didn't know where to look, but I said, where are lesson plan examples? Where are some instructional, like, I'm probably looking for something that I would want, like an instructional video on how to, yeah, I'm sure they're there, and I don't doubt that. But when you're talking about civic engagement and you're talking about public policy, those are heavy-duty topics, you know, for juniors and seniors. I don't even know what year they take them now. I think juniors now. But I think, at least it made me think we're in the right direction, and I just need to learn more. But I think I'm excited that there's going to be some standardization and a district-wide approach to teaching some of our content-level courses.
Mr. President, if I may comment.
Yes, Dr.
There are a
Lau.
couple things with the information that you shared. On the Ohio Department of Ed website, under American Government, the curriculum, there's something called a curriculum brochure, a curriculum map, basically. And there are ideas on there for teaching a specific content area. What we did in some cases was we pulled that directly out of that curriculum guide that was on there, because we're writing a course of study, and you might find it under the clarifications. They also may provide, for example, when you were talking about civic engagement, on that, in that curriculum guide on the State Department website, they may provide some of those resources as well. We haven't gotten to that point where we have our own video library yet. We do know that in the Marzano library, in the Marzano video library, there are teaching samples in there that we'll be working with teachers as we're rolling this out more and more over the next 3 years, of best practices, of teaching ideas. So we do have that as a resource as well. And then the other thing about lesson planning is we rolled out the Marzano lesson plan format. And that format was given to teacher leaders to work with teachers on, and given to principals for them to also work with teachers on. Our unified arts teachers have a unified arts plan because their work is a little different than the day-to-day classroom work that occurs with a core content area. But we do have the Marzano lesson plan that is being used in the buildings. The extent to which it's being used is dependent upon how much has been worked on with the teacher leader and the principal so far with the staff. But it is an expectation that lesson plan be what's developed, because if we're being evaluated by the Marzano ideas, then those need to show up in my lesson plan and in my actual teaching. So we're trying to correlate both so that we aren't evaluating you on something or observing you on something that you haven't prepared or that you don't have written out as far as your lesson planning. So,
If I can follow with just a brief question. I wondered about the professional development. How are we achieving that, you know, our approach? And because this is also new.
sure.
Do we have a high percentage of teachers that are participating in the professional development? We don't have, or maybe we have 100%.
In the elementary schools, we have a period every day for once a week for a grade level. That's called a chat time. And the chat time is used by the teacher leader with that grade level group. So for example, if you're first grade teachers, you come to the chat group on Mondays. And on Monday, we're going to roll out for you professional development on how to give a DIBELS assessment. So in that block of time with me, which is like an extra time, your students have gone back to music, art, physical education, or technology for an enrichment lesson that day. You come in and you work with the teacher leader, 1 on 3, 1 on 4, depending on how large that school is, learning how to do the DIBELS assessment. We're doing the same thing with the Marzano. Once we decide from the instructional design team, there are several elements that we're going to be teaching this year. together with the teacher leaders and the curriculum team, we design the professional development. Then you go back to your building, and during one of your chat times over the next 7 days, you present that staff development to that grade level. So everybody within 7 days has the presentation on design question 2, item number 6, which is chunking information, for example. That's not really it. It's really identifying critical information. But they would have that lesson, that work, that PD work on how do I identify what the critical content is off of this course of study that I teach in a lesson for my kids. So we're rolling it out in that way. So the attendance at an elementary is 100%. At the middle schools and at the high schools, they're doing it slightly different. They're doing it in some of their staff meetings and rolling that out that way, and departmental meetings with their teams. Because they don't have a block of time where everybody goes at the same time.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Baguirov?
And I just have a quick follow-up question. Since now we have pacing guides, they're now correlated to the new courses of study. We've also adopted the Marzano lesson plans as well. So we have those 3 pieces that are all correlated to each other. What about curriculum maps?
The pacing guide is a curriculum map.
So that would
We just
be-
call it a different name.
Okay,
Yes. Mhm.
okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah, and what happens first is we did the course of study, then we did the curriculum map, which is the pacing guide. And depending on whose work you follow, depends on whether you call it a curriculum map or you call it a pacing guide. In the district, because we'd called it pacing guide earlier, we just continued with that name. I'm someone who usually calls it a curriculum map, but we already have pacing guide terminology, so we just kept that.
And then what is our remaining challenge at this point in terms of curriculum and instruction? And giving that structure that Dr. Rountree was referring to as well?
It's implementation and
Well,
monitoring.
Sure.
And that's
sure.
what we need to do for the next year. And we need to make any revisions. If we see something strange as we implement these courses of study, we need to make sure that we correct that, because sometimes if I do a formative assessment, it may not work well with the grade level. So that'll be a constant revision effort probably for the next couple of years, and that's okay. That's just normal. You find out that the question didn't work for the kids, you go back and you rewrite the question and you change how the formative looks. But the biggest challenge that we have right now, besides getting the other ones finished, which we're still working on, is to make sure that we implement with fidelity and that we monitor and that we make sure that what we're teaching is what's written and that it gets done. The materials that we use can be correlated to what we're supposed to be teaching, but they are not the course of study. The materials are a resource that we use. That's why they're listed in the column where they're listed. So we've got to get to that stage where we use our course of study and our pacing guides, and we use the materials, these variety of materials, to implement those.
So in terms of the whole theoretical framework, that's all done, basically. That's all complete. So now we just have to implement it.
Yes. Yes,
That's-
and we started that implementation this year, but again, it's going to take about a year of implementing and monitoring it, making sure that people understand how to write a lesson plan based on a course of study, not based on my basal reader, or not based on my math basal, not based on the science book. It's got to be based on course of study and what I'm supposed to be teaching.
And teacher leaders would be helping with lesson plans?
They will
Lesson plan writing?
help have people understand how to write them, yes. Mhm,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, because that's another choke point with
Yes.
a lot of teachers. They're
Mhm.
confused because of so many changes.
Yes, and we want to make sure they understand that, so.
Thank you.
Can I ask one?
Board Member Taylor, and then we'll come to Vice President Dr. Rountree.
Thank you, Mr. President. See if I'm understanding some of this right. So then we have the teacher leaders, they are going to the trainings, right? So how often are they attending trainings, like weekly or?
I'm smiling because they feel like they're being trained and trained and trained. We warned everyone that this first year they will be trained on every single thing that we have. For example, next week we have 2 days, 8 hours worth of training on MAP. And that's how to read the reports, how to develop those sessions, those data chats with each of the grade levels, how to use the learning continuum so that I can do small group instruction. They've already been trained on DIBELS. The elementary ones have been trained on that with trainers from Amplify. And they walked out of there with a PowerPoint presentation that they were doing with those K-5 teachers to teach them how to do DIBELS. They have Redbird training tomorrow, which is the new math intervention program for elementary. They have a 4-hour or 3-hour training for that tomorrow. Then they're going to have an Achieve 3000 training, and then they meet monthly with me and my team. All together. So that's where we do the Marzano sessions. On October 9th, they're a full day in Marzano with the principals and the assistants on our staff development day. So they're going to be very, very trained. They've already had 4 days, or excuse me, 3 days of coaching. We had 2 this summer. Hamilton County consultants that you approved, they came in and they did coaching seminars with them so they would know how to work with a classroom teacher, work with a principal. And then they had a follow-up last week. We have every other month they have a coaching follow-up where it's just the teacher leader and their coach from Hamilton County. No administrators are in the room, so they can talk about what they need to talk about and get the support system that they need to get. So they're well-trained, hopefully by the end of the year.
It sounds like, if I may continue, Mr.
Absolutely,
President.
please.
So, do they have their own classroom?
No.
Also? Okay.
No.
So then they're actually able to spend time sitting in the classrooms with the teachers and observing so that they can give feedback.
And modeling.
And modeling. Okay. So, I would just like to make a comment that, during my experience here on the board for the long years that I've been here, that I'm ecstatic. I'm kind of emotional here because this is the best information that I've received concerning curriculum across the board. It seems very well organized. It seems to have all the tools in place that are needed, not just for us folks to sit in these rooms and talk about it, but for the teachers to actually be, number one, supported, trained, to have someone at their fingertips to help guide them through this. And so I just want to thank everyone that was involved. And Dr. Lally, you just continue to impress me all the time. I do have to say that because you don't skip a beat, and we ask questions, and you just are always able to fill in the blanks, and I really do appreciate that. And Superintendent Kaur, thank you. I know you brought her on, and I'm just I think we're definitely going to see some changes, okay? And I know everyone is involved, but, just to mention the two. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Dr. Rountree, and then we'll come to Board
Okay.
Member Lee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. I do have to echo what Board Member Taylor said. I do feel very optimistic maybe for the first time, or at least in a long time, that we are definitely headed in the right direction. So I just want to thank both the superintendent and you, Dr. Lally, as well as your team. And I just want to ask a kind of question, a selfish question. I just wonder if you would consider having the lesson plans somewhere in a public place, so that maybe your team members can help identify exemplary lesson plans. And so that, because I said I read it from a first-year perspective and a more seasoned teacher perspective, and I can see where some of the concepts a first-year teacher would need some help. And I know that when I learned how to write a legal brief, the best brief I ever wrote is when they put samples, in the library for us to say, here is a sample of a good brief. And I had every element there, and I said, but gee, if I had just made this approach, it was just reframing some things sometimes. That every law student will have all the information. There's no question about that, as Board Member McManus was saying. But sometimes it's your approach, your argument. And so that's why I only asked if you would please consider that as a new teacher, first-year teacher, if your staff could, I say, I've read all the first grade, lesson plans for this unit. Here are 3 that are very different, but these are what we want. This is what we expect. People seem to rise to expectations, even high expectations. And I know I improved tremendously by just seeing what an A+ paper looked like. I said, I will never settle for anything less. And I hope we instill that kind of pride in our teachers.
That's a good idea, and we can put that